Good evening, everyone. Time for another silver update. Now, this is the weekly chart of gold provided by netdania.com. You can click on the link below. We're going to be talking primarily about gold tonight. I just want to get an overview of the chart. You can see here that this has been a very long correction in the price of gold. Certainly much larger correction than the correction we had during the financial crisis, the brief financial crisis. If this downtrend in gold is an indicator of the financial crisis, then what is this downtrend an indicator of? And will it be followed by a similar uptrend afterwards? I think so. So it's going to be my contention that gold is probably underpriced by a factor of 10, I would guess. The gold should be somewhere around $12,000 an ounce. And I'm going to try to demonstrate that when we look at, we're going to start off by looking at this latest video from Belange P. Now, if you haven't seen his videos, they're very good. You need to go back and watch them all when he's talking about how the gold leasing works and how that is a way of maintaining the petrodollar system. Now, in his last video, he talked about the repatriation of the German gold, and I brought up in the comments that I believe the reason why it's going so slowly is because the Fed and the LBMA don't have the gold. He's going to counter that idea here. We're going to watch a little bit of this, and then I'm going to get into some of the specifics of why I disagree with most of this case.
The first important item to note is that Germany decided that they would seek to store 50% of their gold in their own vaults by the end of 2020 and would leave the remaining 50% in the vaults of New York and London. The slow pace of the repatriation has been pointed to as evidence that the gold does not exist in the vaults of New York. While the possibility can't be ruled out, there are other possibilities that should be considered. What about the decision to leave half of their gold in the New York and London vaults? What could Germany be seeking to accomplish by leaving half of their gold in international storage? A clue to this is the second bolded statement. They acknowledge that one function of gold is to build trust in the currency domestically, so obviously the gold is very important to Germans and their financial system. They then go on to say that gold is needed for exchange for foreign currencies abroad, and that foreign storage is needed so that these transactions can be carried out quickly. This is very important. Why hasn't anybody focused their attention on this portion of the announcement? It basically says that gold is needed in the US and London for currency settlement. Why would gold be needed for settlement if the US and London banks were not using gold as money? This is critical to understand, everyone. Gold is being used as a principal reserve by the central banks, not because of tradition, as Ben Bernanke said, but because they understand the value of gold. Keep this in the back of your head, because it will be central to the remainder of this presentation. If the US and the United Kingdom require the use of gold in settlement for international trade, then they must place a high value on it, much higher than they are disclosing to the public. As such, they would be highly reluctant to part with it. They'd loan it, yes, but let it leave their control? It's unlikely, without a very good reason to do so. So there is a train of thought amongst the precious metals bulls that believe that empty vaults would be bullish for metals prices. I don't dispute that, but have you considered that it would be more bullish for the real value of the metals if they've been tightly held in the vaults for all of these years, with central banks using them as power money this whole time? Imagine what would happen if the paradigm changed and the central bankers were incented to fully value gold for all of the world to see. That, to me, is more bullish, as well as the more likely scenario. But let's take this further. Here, I've summarized what we know about the various gold reserves of various countries. In the upper left, we have what the US claims to hold. It claims that of the over 8,000 tons it has, that only 400 or so are stored in the vaults of New York. The rest of it is in deep storage, or at the US Mint as working stock. Given that the dollar is the world reserve currency, it is not necessary for the U.S. to store gold abroad, or even have much on storage with the Fed, ready to be mobilized quickly. That's one advantage to having a currency that everyone else holds as a reserve. You can keep your gold at home. This is one of the reasons why Germany can pull its gold from France. Since the euro is used for European Monetary Union settlement, there is no reason for Germany to need to have some gold on deposit with France. On the right, we see that the gold reserves claimed by Europe. Notice that Europe, at over 10,000 tons, has more gold on its books than the US. Of these, Germany has about 3,400 tons. Of this, a little less than a third is stored in Frankfurt. About a tenth is stored in Paris, a tenth is stored in London, and the rest, a little less than half, is stored in New York. So the question everyone is raising is whether or not that half of Germany's gold is safe. So let's look at the lower left of this slide, which summarizes the gold that New York claims to hold. There are about 6,700 tons of gold in total. We know that about 25% of this is Germany's. There's a small amount of US gold. The IMF requires by its charter to keep at least 50% of its gold in the US, so this is likely also stored at the New York Fed. And then there is the gold stored by other countries, many of them European. Germany and the rest of the EU have made it abundantly clear that their goal is to diminish the role of US currency for world trade. This was one of the main reasons for the introduction of the euro. The US is absolutely aware that competition is growing in the world trade arena. Let's play some scenarios with the New York Fed gold and US deep storage gold to see what the players are likely to be doing. Let's take as a baseline scenario the case that the gold actually does exist at the New York Fed, as stated, and that the German gold requested will be shipped to Frankfurt by the end of 2020. In this case, the most likely reason for the long time required to transfer all of the gold is that it has been leased out and it will take some time for the leases to expire, but more on that later.
Okay, so I want to stop there with this explanation about the gold being leased out. And I want to comment briefly about this deep storage gold. If I am correct, and I believe I am, when they say deep storage, I believe they're actually talking about mining reserves. So that's doesn't even make any sense. But and if they are, then of course we could say that someplace like the Congo is the richest country in the world because they probably have more deep storage gold. But that's absurd. You can't speculate as to the value of something that's still in the ground and how difficult it's going to be to get it out and how much it's going to cost. But I may be wrong on that. Now, we're talking about this facilitation of world trade by the use of storing gold. And he goes on, or he shows in his earlier videos, how the leasing by the bullion banks is what is the mechanism for the support of the petrodollar system, and that's how they keep the wheels greased. Now, the first question I would ask about that is, if the gold is being leased, who's it being leased to? And I think that's going to get us to the heart of the matter, because I just don't buy the numbers. So let's start off and look at some of the numbers here. Now, this article from Zero Hedge is talking about the amount of gold that's flowing into China on a monthly basis. You can see here that China's gross gold imports from Hong Kong in tons, it reached as high as 220 tons in 1 month, and you can see a lot of these months are at 150 tons. And you can see here the world official gold holdings. As he comments, one thing is certain: the number of China's official gold holdings, which has not been updated in nearly 5 years since early 2009, is now hopelessly inaccurate. And we can see these gold holdings. So let's go over to Wikipedia and take a look at these gold reserves. Now, supposedly it says here, as of June 2013, based on World Gold Council data. these are the reserves of all the countries. Now, this isn't talking about where those reserves are held. That's going to be another topic, and I think that we can't possibly know the truth about that either. But I just want to show you on the face of it how ridiculous and bizarre these numbers seem to be. First of all, let's look at countries that have the most gold reserves, and that's how this is broken down initially. You can see we have 31,000 tons. If you do the math on that at current prices, I did it before, it comes to, I believe it comes to about $1.25 trillion. Maybe I'm off by a decimal there. But if we look at the amount claimed to be held by the United States, you can see how much of that number is. Then you have Germany, the IMF, Italy, France, China. So those are the big ones according to gold in tons. But let's look at gold's share of Forex reserves and list the countries in order of that. Now, you would think that a country that has a high amount of its foreign exchange reserves held in gold would be a wealthier and healthier country. Well, let's look at the list here. We've got Portugal is number 1, Greece is number 2, the United States is number 3. I would definitely say those are 3 economic basket cases to start with. Germany, I think, is debatable. Venezuela, Cyprus, Italy, France. So I think you get the picture here. Do you believe that these are the strongest countries in the world economically? It seems to me that these are some of the weakest countries in the world economically. Now let's flip this around and look at it in terms of the lowest percentage. We've got Russia, of course, not really reporting, and the BIS not really reporting. But we've got Hong Kong at 0. We've got Canada, Hungary, China, South Korea, Malaysia, and here's some of the oil states here. You've got Qatar, Saudi Arabia. Here's Singapore. I guess Singapore is a very weak country economically. So you can see here that everything seems to be upside down. It doesn't make a lot of sense. The countries that have very, very tiny percentages of gold reserves for their Forex, such as China at 1%. Think about that. This 1,000 represents 1%. What if China goes to what the United States claims it has? They'd have to increase their reserves dozens fold. But I think this gives lie to this idea that these are accurate numbers. Now, if you remember FOFOA has a similar theory. FOA was the originator, and his theory was that there's a backdoor sort of backing of the petrodollar via gold, and that wherever the oil is flowing from, then the gold is going to flow there. And this gold leasing by this video by Blanche P is a similar sort of idea, except that it's not concentrating on those oil producing states. But let's look at the oil producing states here and do some quick math. So we'll pull up Saudi Arabia here in this list. We'll just do them by country. And I'm not seeing it here. I believe it is about 5%. So it's way down on the list. And as well as all of the other oil producing states are way, way down on the list, around 3, 4, 5, 6%. Here's Syria, here's Morocco. And I'm not finding it, but we'll just say it's 5%. There's Kuwait. Now let's look at the amount of oil that Saudi Arabia sells. And again, we're just looking at one country, Saudi Arabia, thinking of the FOFOA thesis. So this is Saudi oil production. You can see it's updated to, I would say, mid-2012 here, but we can see that it's held steady between 9 and 10. We'll just use a round figure of 10, and you can see this is in millions of barrels per day. So that's going to come to 10 million barrels per day of oil production, and we'll just do the math on that real quick. So we've got 10 million times 365 days in a year. So Saudi Arabia is producing 3.6 billion barrels of oil in a year. We'll multiply that just by around $100 a barrel, and we come up with $365 billion worth of oil that Saudi Arabia is exporting to the rest of the world every year. Now, let's just say that 10% of this is held as Forex reserves. We don't know what the cost is. I suspect the cost isn't that high, but for sake of argument, we'll just say that it's 10%. Pure profit can be held as Forex reserves. That comes to about $36 billion. Now we know that, let's just find it here, that we know that the Saudis claim to have 2% of their foreign exchange reserves held in gold. That amounts to 322 metric tons, I believe. Is this in metric tons? It just says gold tons. We'll assume that it's metric tons. So if we look at this handy dandy chart here, we've got these different units of value for gold, and the one down at the bottom I believe is the one that they're using, and that's metric ton. So we've got $40 million, and this is going to be at the current price, close enough, $12.43. So we're going to say that a ton is worth $40 million. Saudi Arabia is selling $365 billion worth of oil every single year. And you've seen by the chart that's gone on for a long time. This chart, the price of oil has changed, but you can see that they have exported a large amount of oil for a very, very long time. So if we believe their claim that they only have 322 tons in their reserves, and that's worth 40 million per metric ton, then the value of all the Saudi gold reserves is only $12.8 billion. That doesn't make any sense. How could FOFOA's thesis be true if this is just 3% of the amount of oil that's sold every year by Saudi Arabia? So I think that if you look at these, you probably agree with me that there's no way that these gold reserves figures can be accurate, that it's all lies. We don't know where any of this gold is. And that's why I'm going to disagree on that idea that Belange P is putting forth, that the Western governments are going to be incentivized to hold that gold on those exchanges such as the LBMA for world trade. So let's watch a little bit more of that, and then I'm going to comment.
In this scenario, you can see that the US accounts for 37% of the gold of the group discussed on the previous slide. All of the European Monetary Union has about half, of which Germany is a little less than a third of that. In the event of a system reset where the petrodollar is replaced by another currency where gold plays a major role, the US would have a greatly reduced role relative to where they are now, and a slightly smaller role than the European Union. This would be a fairly comfortable position for Germany and the rest of the European Monetary Union. It is also a fairly comfortable position for the US. The US might not like it as much as the current system, but the US would still have a fairly big chair at the table. Here is the opposite end of the spectrum. It is the doomsday scenario, where the US does not have the gold that it claims to have in deep storage. The New York Fed also does not have the gold that it claims to have. Suppose Germany was to force the issue and demand all of their gold back right now. They're certainly entitled to do so, provided, of course, that it hasn't been leased out by Germany itself. In this scenario, the other countries would demand that the US make good on the gold owed, but there would be no gold to be returned. So in this case, the US reveals to the world that it has no gold, or greatly less than stated. The IMF would lose half or all of the gold that it thought it had. Germany and the rest of the European Union would have less gold than they thought they had, but they would basically have all of the power. The US would have no power at all. This would certainly align with the interests of a powerful Europe. So if it really was the case, then why would Germany not force the issue by not only demanding that their gold be returned immediately, but demanding that all of it be returned? Further, why would the US put themselves in this position? They know that gold is the trump card. They know that the dollar will likely be replaced with something else eventually. Why would they give up this trump card? While this scenario must be admitted as one of the possibilities, I think the one at the top is far more likely. So let's consider another scenario where there is no gold at the New York Fed to be returned to Germany. If that's the case, then there's probably no gold to be returned to anyone. Now remember, the dollar is issued by the Fed, and so if the Fed defaults on its obligations, then the dollar will either completely vaporize or will decrease in value tremendously. Gold as the trump card would have to be used if the US was to retain any power. In order for the US to participate in world trade with legitimate currency going forward, the US would need to defend the dollar by making good on all of the claims on gold with the Fed. In this scenario, the European Monetary Union would hold almost 75% of the gold here. The US would only hold 7%. In other words, the US would have less power on the world stage than the country of Italy. Certainly, this is a position that the US does not want to be in. It is also a position that Germany would want to reveal to the world as quickly as possible if it was true. So again, I'm inclined to believe the scenario shown at the top, where the delays in delivery are truly because of gold leasing and not because of lack of existence of the gold.
Now again, gold leasing to who? Who's leasing the gold and where is it? Now, I think what this scenario leaves out is that I believe that both Europe and England and the United States are all going to be left out of the next system. I think China's gold reserves are probably 10 times this stated figure. And I think that the United States gold reserves are probably 1/10 of this figure. So that put the United States down around 800, if just all things being equal. But Germany, of course, would be cut in half or more. And so you would have Germany and the United States with about an equal share, which each would be equal to about 1/10 of China. I think that's probably a more accurate view of what's actually going on in the world. I certainly can't believe that Europe is a bastion of health. Here is a group of nations who are collectively committing suicide. If you go into Asia and look at the unemployment rate there, it's around 3 or 4%. There's always a job, pretty much in the Asian countries. A lot of them don't believe in a lot of the social safety nets. You don't have that option. Whereas in Europe, and increasingly we're seeing in the United States, although in the United States they're simply lying about how many people are unemployed. But in Europe, we have entire nations there that have youth unemployment rates exceeding 50% and adult unemployment rates exceeding 20%. There's no way that those nations are going to be world trading powers. And the fact that these nations are the ones that are listed at the top of percentage in gold reserves indicates to me that none of this is accurate, that these are all lies, and that China has much, much more gold, and probably many of the other countries that are down here at the very bottom with China probably have much more gold. Are we to believe that Canada has 3.2? Canada only has 3 tons of gold. South Korea only has 100 tons of gold. Malaysia only has 36 tons of gold. These Middle Eastern oil states only have tiny, tiny amounts of gold. And then, of course, Saudi Arabia only has 322 metric tons of gold. I don't believe it. I don't think that you can lend any credence to these reported figures. I think that when we find out, when the music stops and everybody tries to find a chair, we're going to find out that not only the United States, but England and all of Europe are going to be impoverished, and we're going to find that China and Russia and a lot of the other Asian nations are much, much richer than we thought they were. And we'll talk to you next time.